working with young children that's very different from working with an older student or an adult is that a young child isn't able to share their experience with you in a direct way. You're going to be watching their body language, are their cheeks getting a little flushed or their eyes getting a little glassy? And your job as a teacher for a young child is to really help them frame that experience and help them to be in communication about whatever it is that they're going through. Now, as the authority figure, when you're with a young child, you have a status that's much more elevated compared to when you're with an older student or an adult. For a young child, authority figures have almost a larger than life quality. And if you think about it, if Santa Claus knows whether or not you've been bad or good as a young child, your violin teacher did not make a sequencing mistake. So if you're playing a song and it's like too hard for you and you're really struggling, it's not because they gave you the wrong song or gave you something that was too hard. Of course they're going to assume that it's because there's something about them that's not good enough or not smart enough, and they're going to take it really personally. So their frustration tolerance is going to be a little lower simply because they don't have the ability to step back and frame that as, my teacher gave me something that was too hard and I just need to get in communication. No, they're taking it personally. So we have to take responsibility for kind of seeing those signals and helping them to frame that. So when I see that a student is really struggling with something, or if I'm worried that they might be kind of struggling with something, I'll ask that question like, hey Aaron, this is really hard, isn't it? And he might say, yeah, it is. Or he might say, but that's okay, because at that age, their ego defenses are really protecting them from experiencing self-doubt. They may feel it, but they have a very strong positive self-image of themselves, and that's part of it. Something that goes along with being a young child is that they're naturally kind of overconfident, and so often they won't express a sense of self-doubt, at least verbally to you, and certainly not verbally to themselves. So they may say that it's not hard, and that's okay, but I've still given him room for that experience to be whatever it is. Now, something that I'm not going to do if I think that he's having a hard time with the experience, if I say, oh, that was really hard, wasn't it? And he says, yes, it was. I'm not going to reassure him, like, you can do it, or whatever we might say to each other, kind of cheerleading him. Because what happens when someone is a cheerleader for us and we feel comfortable for that person, we are going to then hand them all of our insecurities. No, I can't do it because this, and because I'm like that, and because this other time that I tried to do it, I wasn't able to, and I'm really worried about it because this, and if I fail, I'm gonna that. The natural impulse that we have if someone is reassuring us is we're going to kind of argue with that, whether we verbalize it or whether we just kind of like resist it internally. So I really just want to mirror back his experience. I don't want to try to do anything with it. I don't want to reassure him. I just want to let it be. And my act of just letting it stand and letting him be in communication and not doing anything more than that sends the communication to him that he is bigger than that feeling of struggle. He's bigger than that feeling of fear, anxiety, or whatever it is. I'm giving it a voice, and we're just allowing it to be fine. Part of what I want to cultivate in my students, and part of the tremendous value that they're going to get out of music lessons, whether that's violin or piano or whatever, is some of those cognitive self-awareness skills. So one of those skills is the ability to reflect on their own experience, the ability to reflect on the emotion that they're having. And that's something that develops naturally over time, but we can also support that process. And one of the ways that I do this with a young child is I want them to start to cultivate a habit of reflecting on their experience. And I'm not going to have them try to give me an expository essay on how they're feeling. But what I can do is I can make it really easy for them. Like that activity that we just did. Would you say that was easy, medium, or hard? And that's giving them some language that I've pre-formulated. It's a very easy choice, but it's asking them to take a moment to reflect on their own experience and then share that back. And then, later on, a year later in their lessons, they've had these questions many times over many, many violin lessons. A year later, I can say, how was that for you? And now I am asking an open-ended question, but they already have the tools to say, yeah, it was pretty easy, or I don't know, that was a little hard, or there was something hard about that, but it was fine, or whatever it is, because we've already had some of those conversations that are building them to that point. Having them complete that experience is a really wonderful way to kind of close a chapter of the lesson, bring emotional completeness, especially if it was something that was hard, but even if it was something that wasn't that hard for them. We're really kind of bringing a sense of finality to that portion of the learning process, and it gives them a chance to reflect on the learning process and really own what just happened, and that gives them a little bit more of an emotional blank canvas to move on to whatever that next project is. One of the interesting things about the teaching relationship is that there's this dance between your role as the authority figure, which is a really useful role to have. You want to have that strong authority figure because there's something powerful about that. You can really push the student, they look up to you, you can demand things of them. You want to have that, and on the other hand, you want to create a balance between that and giving them ownership of the lesson process and giving them ownership of their violin experience. One of the ways that I do this in lesson is I want to let them be the one to discover something. So for example, I'll make a really terrible bow hold and say, can you fix my bow hold? And they love being in that sort of teacher role. They love seeing me make a bad bow hold. It creates this really nice dialogue where it's not me saying, do this, do that, do that. But instead, it's more creating an adult-to-adult conversation, and they crave that adult-to-adult relationship. So it's very meaningful to have those opportunities, and you can see their sense of pride just grow as soon as they have an opportunity to take the teacher role. Another way that I do this is I'll play something really scratchy for them. And I'll say, that was pretty good, because of course it's better than they can do, so I want to say that. That was pretty good, but there was a mistake that I was making. Can you figure out what it was? And I'll give them an opportunity to try to figure it out. And it'll often take them a lot of tries, because they're not really clear on, what makes something good, what makes something bad. Sometimes I can tell that they're guessing, they don't really know, and if that's the case, I'll ask them, were you guessing? And if they were, then I'll say, well, let me play it again, and I want you to really listen to it. I also let them know sometimes just explicitly, like, when you guess, that's not good, because then I don't really get to find out what you were thinking. I'd rather you just say, I have no idea, and then I'll do it again. And then that next time they'll say, I have no idea. But that honesty is really valuable, and that whole dialogue is really great, because even if the answers are wrong, I'm getting really good information about what they're hearing and what they're not hearing. Another thing that I try to do in the lessons is I want to give them not just ownership over the process of the lesson, but I also want to start giving away that ownership of the learning process. And one of the ways I do that is to have them reflect on where they are in that learning stage. So say we've done something 5 or 6 or 7 times, they've got it a few times, I know that they can do it, and I don't know how clear that kind of understanding is in their mind, and I don't know how clear that skill is in their body, how comfortable it is. Are they going to remember it 6 hours from now when they go home and practice? So I'll ask them, is this in your head? Do you have it? Or could it still fall out when you go home? And sometimes they'll say, I think I've got it. Sometimes they might stop and think about it for a while, and it looks like nothing is happening. And that might look to a teacher like dead time. There might be an urge to maybe try to give them the answer or say something. And you want to just allow that dead time, because it's not really dead time. They are reflecting on their own learning process. They're trying to figure out, have I mastered that? What does it mean to master something? Do I know all the components of this skill? So that quiet time where they're reflecting, something really important is happening. And when you create room for that, In the lesson, you're also setting a model for what you want them to do when they get home. You want them, when they're at home, to be reflecting on their practice. Like, I've done this 5 times. Have I mastered it? No, not really. How many more times do I need? Maybe 5 more times. Whatever that is. But if we don't model that in their lesson and give them time to reflect on their own process, then they're not going to be doing that when they go home. A lot of times I'll also say something to the parent, perhaps at the end of the lesson I'll point out how I kind of gave the child a voice in the lesson, gave the child a voice in figuring how many times we were going to do something. And the reason is because it may not come naturally for the parents to do that same thing at home. Now maybe it will, maybe they're really someone who is naturally creating that balanced relationship with their child, but on the other hand, a parent is already very far outside of their comfort zone when they're working with their child to learn violin, because they don't play violin. So some of those things that might come naturally in another context, they might not remember to do when they're in that moment practicing with their child. And giving that context away to the parent and making sure that that context of empowerment is happening at home as well is really one of the most important things we can do, because that child is then going to have a positive experience of practicing. There's going to be a much lower conflict environment between the parent and the child. They're going to be enjoying each other much more. And it invests the child not only in the learning process, but it allows them to really be invested in their entire violin study. And there's no replacement for that.